The news first broke not in an official press release, but in a whispered rumor that spread like wildfire from cell to cell, then leaked past the razor wire and into the free world. 5 women, 5 inmates locked behind concrete walls in what was supposed to be one of the most tightly run prisons in the South, were pregnant. The revelation didn't just raise eyebrows, it ignited outrage. Families demanded answers. Advocacy groups lined up outside the gates with picket signs, and cable news anchors speculated breathlessly. How could this happen? Who allowed it? Inside the prison, the atmosphere turned electric. The women shuffled through the chow hall with their hands pressed protectively to their bellies, eyes darting, trying to avoid the stares of other inmates who hissed accusations or whispered in disbelief. Some said it was consensual, others muttered darker things. Abuse, coercion, deals struck in shadows. But no one could explain why it had happened to all 5 women almost at the same time. That detail made it feel less like coincidence and more like a plan. For the warden, the man who strutted through the prison with polished shoes and a chest full of authority, the scandal should have been his downfall. Yet he carried himself with the same cold confidence, nodding at guards, barking orders like nothing was out of place. On the surface, he was a decorated officer who had survived 2 prison riots and received awards for discipline and order. But behind closed doors, there were whispers about his late-night rounds in the women's wing, about favors granted to inmates who suddenly found themselves shielded from punishments, moved to cushier jobs, or mysteriously receiving contraband no one else could get. The 5 women themselves came from different walks of life. A mother who killed her abusive husband. A young college student who made a financial mistake that ruined her future. A hardened gang member who carried the weight of enemies outside the walls. Each had their own story, their own demons. Yet now, all of them carried the same secret, one that bound them to each other against their will. The state's Department of Corrections tried to downplay the uproar at first. A spokesman gave a clipped statement about ongoing inquiries and internal investigations, but the damage was already done. Reporters dug into records. Neighbors of the women's families gave quotes to cameras, and social media spun conspiracy theories faster than anyone could control. People wanted answers. Was this a cover-up? Who was protecting who? And how deep did the corruption go? Meanwhile, tension inside the prison boiled over. Other inmates demanded to know why these 5 women seemed untouchable, why they were given medical checkups, and moved away from general population. Jealousy mixed with fear. Some inmates said the pregnancies made the women targets. If the warden had chosen them, he could just as easily decide to discard them. Others warned that whoever had orchestrated this wanted chaos, and chaos was coming. The story might have ended as just another scandal in America's troubled prison system, another tale of abuse and lawsuits, if not for what happened next. Because one by one, the women who were supposed to be carrying life inside them began to face something far darker. Death, violence, and the realization that the man in charge wasn't just abusing his power. He was staging something, a twisted experiment in domination, fear, and control. For those 5 women, the pregnancies weren't just shocking revelations. They were a countdown. And for the warden, every tick of the clock was part of a deadly scheme no one on the outside could have imagined. By the time the scandal broke, everyone in the prison already knew his name. The warden wasn't just a man in uniform. He was the embodiment of power. To the guards, he was a strict commander who demanded polished boots, spotless reports, and unflinching loyalty. To the inmates, he was both judge and executioner, capable of turning a miserable sentence into a bearable one, or into hell itself. He liked it that way. His whole career had been built on the idea that respect was meaningless without fear. On paper, his resume read like a model of correctional leadership. A decorated officer with nearly 2 decades of service, he'd been credited with quelling 2 riots, tightening contraband control, and earning praise from the state's Department of Corrections. There was even a framed plaque in his office commemorating outstanding leadership in crisis management. But behind the oak door, beneath the medals and awards, lived a man who thrived on manipulation. He didn't just enforce rules. He bent them, twisted them, weaponized them. He'd built his reputation on the idea that order was everything. But the truth was, chaos excited him. And a woman who feared isolation and solitary confinement would trade almost anything to avoid it. He prowled the cell blocks at odd hours, his footsteps echoing down dimly lit corridors when most of the prison slept. The female inmates dreaded hearing his keys jingle in the night because they knew what it meant. But when the sun rose, he wore his authority like armor. Crisp shirt, tie pulled tight, voice booming across the yard as he lectured about discipline and rehabilitation. In front of cameras or visiting officials, he was the portrait of professionalism. In the shadows, he was a predator. The way he operated was insidious. He never barked threats outright. Instead, he traded favors. A woman caught with contraband suddenly found herself spared a write-up if she cooperated. A prisoner desperate for a phone call to her child might be granted one if she agreed to meet him later. He made promises about reduced sentences, early parole recommendations, better food, or even something as small as an extra blanket in winter. Each deal tightened his grip until the women weren't just inmates anymore. They were pawns. The pregnancies were no accident. They were his design. He enjoyed the secrecy, the dangerous gamble of how long it could be hidden, the way it bound those women together in a conspiracy of silence. To him, it wasn't just about lust, it was about power. Planting life inside them was the ultimate proof that he controlled their bodies, their futures, their very identities. He had taken away their last piece of autonomy, and he relished it. And yet, he was careful. He didn't flaunt what he was doing. To the guards under his command, he played the role of an unshakable disciplinarian. If anyone whispered suspicions, he reminded them of the jobs he'd saved, the pay raises he'd fought for, the families he'd protected during violent uprisings. He knew exactly how to buy silence. Fear to the rest. What no one could see, not even his closest allies, was that he was staging something larger. This wasn't about 5 women or 5 pregnancies. It was about building a storm inside those walls. He wanted to watch the prison fracture, to watch inmates turn on each other, to see the world outside reel from the revelation. In his mind, it was a kind of performance, a twisted experiment. The warden believed that in the ecosystem of prison, he was more than a man. He was the architect of suffering, the god of order and chaos. And when the scandal finally erupted beyond those walls, he didn't panic. He straightened his tie, walked the corridors like he owned them, and told himself the truth that had always guided him. Power wasn't about avoiding scandal. Power was about surviving it. Tamika was the kind of inmate the prison never quite knew what to do with. At 36, she carried herself with the brisk, no-nonsense air of the nurse she used to be. Before her conviction, she had spent her days in scrubs, handing out medications, tending wounds, and reminding patients to take their pills. But temptation had crept in, the chance to make money skimming prescription drugs and selling them on the side. When she was caught, the courts showed no mercy. Behind bars, Tamika still had that clinical calm, but everyone knew she was watching, cataloging every cough, every bruise, every slip of weakness in the women around her. Her secret wasn't her crime. It was the notebook she kept tucked in her mattress, full of observations about guards and inmates alike. Information was her weapon, and she intended to survive. Renee was older, 42, and carried a quiet heaviness that made younger inmates steer clear of her. She was doing 20 years for second-degree murder, but the story wasn't as simple as the paperwork suggested. Her husband had been cruel, the kind of man who made the walls of their small house feel like a prison long before she ever saw the inside of a cell block. One night, she fought back, and he didn't get up again. The jury didn't see self-defense. They saw rage. Now Renee walked the yard with a hollow look in her eyes, clutching the photo of her teenage daughter like it was oxygen. Her secret was the letters, dozens of them, that she never sent, stacked under her bunk. Letters begging her daughter to forgive her, to still call her mom. The pregnancy forced on her wasn't just a violation of her body. To Renee, it was a betrayal of the only role she'd ever wanted, being a mother. Carla was the opposite. At 28, She was fire wrapped in a petite frame, all tattoos and sharp words. Her rap sheet was long: armed robbery, drug trafficking, assault, but what really defined her was the gang affiliation etched in ink across her knuckles. Even in prison, her reputation preceded her. Some inmates gravitated toward her for protection. Others kept their distance, afraid of the enemies she carried like shadows. Carla's secret wasn't her crime, it was her fear. The gang she'd once lived for had marked her as expendable. Rumors whispered that if she ever saw freedom again, she'd be dead within weeks. The pregnancy complicated everything. It wasn't just an unwanted burden, it was leverage someone could use against her. And in a place where leverage meant life or death, Carla knew she'd just become more vulnerable than ever. Monique, barely 22, looked like she had wandered into prison by mistake. She wasn't hardened, not yet. Her crime was white-collar, embezzling funds from the small business where she worked as an accountant's assistant. She had been desperate, trying to cover medical bills for her sick mother, but desperation didn't sway the jury. She had soft hands, careful speech, and a constant air of disbelief, like she still couldn't accept where she was. The other inmates teased her for being too gentle, too naive. But Monique's secret was that she was sharper than she let on. She listened, memorized, calculated. She wasn't a fighter, but she was a survivor, and she had begun to quietly collect favors, debts, and information. The pregnancy, however, wasn't something she could calculate away. It tethered her in a way she couldn't outthink, and for the first time, she felt truly trapped. Then there was Shauna, 30, tough, and built like she could go toe-to-toe with any guard. Shauna was in for manslaughter after a bar fight spiraled into bloodshed. She had the kind of presence that filled a room. Booming laugh, crude jokes, the swagger of someone who refused to be broken. Guards called her volatile, inmates called her crazy, but Shauna thrived on fear. What no one realized was that her bravado masked a deep loneliness. She had no family left on the outside, no visitors, no letters, nothing but the four walls and her reputation. That was her secret, that behind the sneer and the fists, she craved connection. When she found herself pregnant, something in her shifted. For a fleeting moment, she thought maybe she could have something of her own, something no one could take. But in a prison run by a predator, even that fragile hope was dangerous. Together, the five women formed an unlikely circle of silence. Different ages, different crimes, different pasts, but now bound by the same cruel reality. None of them had asked for this, and none of them could escape it. They were marked, not just by their growing bellies, but by the invisible strings the warden had tied around them. And those strings were pulling tighter every day. The prison had always been a place of tension. Whispers in the chow line, fights that erupted over nothing, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing against steel bars. But after the truth about the five women spread, the air inside thickened into something almost tangible. Every hallway conversation seemed to circle back to the same question. How did this happen? The women weren't just inmates anymore. They were symbols, proof that someone on the inside had crossed a line, and everyone was terrified of what that meant. The other prisoners reacted first with disbelief, then with fury. Some muttered that the women must have volunteered for it, trading sex for privileges, betraying the unwritten rules of inmate solidarity. Others saw them as victims, forced into silence by fear of punishment. The truth was messier than anyone wanted to admit. The pregnancies weren't just personal scandals. They were signs that the balance of power had shifted in a way no one could predict. Meals became tense standoffs. Shauna's laugh no longer carried across the cafeteria. It was cut short by stares from jealous women who accused her of being protected. Monique ate quickly, eyes down, flinching at every snide comment about Warden's favorite. Tamika, the nurse-turned inmate, felt the glares burn into her back as though she'd orchestrated the whole thing. Even Renee, who had always kept her head down, found herself cornered in the showers by two inmates demanding to know what she had given up to earn the warden's attention. But it wasn't just inmates who were talking. The guards felt the shift too. Some whispered among themselves, shaking their heads. worried their careers could go up in smoke if investigators dug too deep. Others kept silent, their loyalty to the warden outweighing their unease. A few even joked cruelly, calling the 5 women the nursery wing, as if mocking them would make the scandal less real. Everyone knew his reach was long enough to ruin anyone. Rumors began to twist into threats. Notes slipped under doors warned the women to keep quiet. One morning, Monique woke to find the word snitch scrawled on her cell wall in chalk. The message was clear: talk, and you're dead. Carla, with her gang ties, was pulled aside by 2 inmates who demanded answers. Was this some kind of organized plan, a power grab? Carla denied it, but the suspicion lingered. The fear wasn't only about what had happened. It was about what might happen next. Some inmates whispered that the warden wasn't finished, that the pregnancies were just the beginning of something bigger, something designed to pit them against one another. Others believed that the women were marked for death, that their swollen bellies were targets in a twisted game no one could escape. At night, the prison buzzed with paranoia. Locks clicked louder than before, footsteps in the hall made hearts race, and the echo of keys in the dark turned stomachs cold. The 5 women clung to each other in hushed conversations, swearing they hadn't asked for this, swearing they wanted out. But they knew better than to trust anyone else. Outside the walls, the scandal began leaking into news feeds and late-night talk shows. Inside, it was a powder keg. One wrong word, one accusation too many, and violence could ignite. The warden, calm and unshaken, walked the halls with the same polished shoes, nodding to guards, glancing at the women like they were pieces on a chessboard. To him, the suspicion, the fear, the chaos, it was all part of the show. And the inmates, whether they liked it or not, were already playing their roles. It happened on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was breaking through the razor wire and the yard was stirring awake. Carla, the tough-talking gang affiliate who never showed fear, was found hanging from a strip of bedsheet tied crudely to the bars of her cell window. The scene looked like suicide, at least at first glance. Her lips were blue, her body still swaying slightly in the stale air. A guard on rounds blew his whistle, and the sound ricocheted across the tier like a gunshot. The official line was quick and clinical. By noon, the prison issued a statement: inmate death, suspected self-harm, investigation pending. The warden's voice was steady when he addressed the staff, telling them this was an unfortunate but isolated incident. Yet no one believed it. Not really. Carla hadn't been the type to fold. The day before, she'd been spotted in the yard, laughing too loudly, flashing her tattoos like warnings to anyone dumb enough to cross her. She had spoken about her son, how she wanted him to know she was still alive. And more telling, she had confided to another inmate that she feared someone was after her. "They don't want us to talk," she whispered, "and I ain't going down quiet." Those were not the words of a woman about to take her own life. The other inmates knew it, and the fear that had been simmering turned into panic. Renee sat on her bunk, clutching her photo, whispering, "They're picking us off." Monique couldn't eat, staring at her tray as though it might hold clues. Tamika scribbled furiously in her hidden notebook, recording every detail. The time the whistle blew, the guard's reaction, the way Carla's cell had been left unlocked for longer than usual the night before. Shauna, fists clenched, muttered that whoever did it was going to pay. Rumors spread faster than the smell of bleach used to scrub the cell clean. Some swore they heard Carla arguing with a guard the night before. Others claimed to have seen the warden himself walking that tier past lights out, his shadow stretching along the concrete. A few whispered darker theories. Maybe it wasn't just about silencing Carla. Maybe it was about sending a message to the others. Stay quiet, or this is what happens. The guards' reactions were no less suspicious. One officer nervously chain-smoked in the break room, muttering that Carla should have known better. Another laughed too loudly, insisting it was open and shut, nothing to see here. But their eyes betrayed something else, fear that they might be dragged into an investigation that could ruin them. The warden, for his part, seemed almost invigorated. He toured the cell block that afternoon, his voice low, his words clipped. "Tragedy," he said, shaking his head at the women who dared to look him in the eye. But his gaze lingered just a moment too long on the 4 remaining inmates, and they understood the unspoken message: you could be next. Carla's death didn't bring closure. It ripped open the fabric of the prison, exposing the rot beneath. For the other women, it was proof that no favor, no silence, no whispered deal could protect them. If Carla, fierce and defiant Carla, could be found swinging from a sheet, then none of them were safe. Outside the prison walls, the news was framed as another grim statistic. Female inmate commits suicide. The headlines read, buried beneath stories of politics and celebrity scandals. But inside, it was different. Inside, it was a warning shot, a spark in a powder keg. And as the sun dipped back below the walls that night, the women lay awake in their bunks, their bellies heavy, their breaths shallow. They weren't just prisoners anymore. They were targets in a deadly game they hadn't agreed to play. And the first piece had just been taken off the board. The morning after Carla's death, the prison corridors hummed with a tension that no amount of bleach or official statements could wash away. The warden might have hoped the story would fade as just another inmate's suicide, but someone higher up wasn't buying it. By the end of the week, a team from a state inspector general's office arrived unannounced, their suits and clipboards a jarring contrast to the gray cinderblock walls. With them came Detective Alicia Monroe, a sharp-eyed investigator with a reputation for pulling at threads until the whole fabric unraveled. She started where the prison brass least wanted her to look: Carla's cell. The walls were bare, her few belongings boxed up, but Alicia's instincts told her the scene had been staged too neatly. The strip of sheet tied to the bars was still there, stiff and stained, but something didn't add up. Carla was barely 5 feet tall, yet the knot was positioned high, far higher than she could have tied without standing on something. But no stool, no chair, no improvised step was found in the cell. Alicia moved on to the cameras. The official log said the system had malfunctioned the night of Carla's death, a convenient blackout window spanning exactly 40 minutes. She'd seen enough prisons to know when a glitch was too precise to be real. At the IT hub, she pressed a trembling technician until he admitted that someone with high-level clearance had manually erased the footage. He wouldn't say who, but Alicia didn't need him to. Only a handful of people had that kind of access, and the warden was at the top of the list. The guards were even more telling. When Alicia questioned them, their answers came rehearsed, clipped to uniform, as though they'd been coached. One insisted Carla had been acting withdrawn. Another swore she'd talked about ending it all. But Alicia had already interviewed half a dozen inmates who claimed the opposite. One woman, shaking as she spoke, swore Carla had been upbeat, even joking the day before. Another whispered that Carla had confided her fear of being silenced. Their stories clashed violently with the guard's version, and Alicia knew exactly which side smelled like the truth. But the most chilling discovery came from the infirmary. Carla's medical chart had been pulled after her death, and Alicia noticed inconsistencies in the log. Notes had been altered, time scratched out, rewritten in different handwriting. More disturbingly, blood work from weeks earlier revealed elevated hormone levels that matched early pregnancy. Carla had never mentioned it, never had the chance. The realization hit Alicia hard. Carla wasn't just silenced. She had been carrying evidence inside her own body. The other 4 women were terrified. When Alicia approached them, each hesitated, glancing over their shoulders before speaking. Renee clutched her daughter's photograph like a shield, whispering, "If I talk, he'll kill me too." Monique's hands shook so badly, she dropped her cup of water during the interview. Tamika slid Alicia a folded scrap of paper with hurried notes, dates, times, names of guards who'd looked the other way. And Shauna, ever defiant, leaned forward and spat. "You want the truth? The warden owns this place. We're just his toys." Every interview deepened the pit in Alicia's stomach. This wasn't negligence. This was orchestration. And the warden wasn't just bending rules. He was building a theater of control, using women's lives as props. When she confronted him directly, his smile was thin, practiced. He leaned back in his leather chair, hands folded over his chest, and dismissed the accusations with a calmness that felt rehearsed. You think I'd risk my career for a few inmates' fantasies? These women lie for a living. It's how they survive. His voice was smooth, almost bored. But when Alicia mentioned the erased footage, his jaw tightened, just slightly, a crack in the armor. By the time she left his office, Alicia knew she was standing in the middle of something bigger than a single death. The prison wasn't just a place of confinement. It was a stage set for a man's obsession with domination. Carla's death was only the first act, and unless she moved quickly, more bodies were going to drop. The investigation should have slowed things down, but instead it poured gasoline on a fire that was already raging. By the time Detective Alicia Monroe had been inside the prison for a week, the balance of power had shifted dangerously. The inmates knew the truth was beginning to leak, the guards knew their careers were at risk, and the warden, smiling too calmly, knew he still held the upper hand. It started with whispers that turned into shouting matches. In the yard, women accused the pregnant inmates of cutting deals, of being the warden's chosen ones. Shauna, never one to back down, nearly came to blows when another prisoner spat the word snitch in her face. Guards had to drag her away before fists flew. The tension thickened until every mealtime, every shower rotation felt like a standoff waiting to explode. Then came the second attack. Monique, the youngest of the five, was rushed to the infirmary one evening after being found sprawled on the concrete outside her cell, bleeding from a gash on her head. She survived, but barely. Her injuries didn't look like the result of a fall. There were bruises on her wrists, the kind that came from being held down. When Alicia tried to question her in the infirmary, Monique burst into tears and whispered, "He said if I told you anything, I'd end up like Carla." She wouldn't name him, but she didn't have to. The attack spread panic like wildfire. Inmates were convinced someone was hunting the five women one by one. Guards patrolled more aggressively, barking orders, slamming batons against doors, trying to control the chaos. Instead, their heavy-handedness only fueled it. Women refused to leave their cells, refused to eat, refused to work prison detail. Every clang of the gates felt like the prelude to violence. Outside, the story finally broke wide. Local news stations broadcast shaky cell phone footage smuggled out by a visiting family member. 5 visibly pregnant women being herded across the yard under guard. The images were damning. Overnight, the prison became a spectacle, with protesters camped outside the gates holding signs that read, "Prison or playground," and "Who guards the guards?" National outlets picked up the scandal, and by morning, satellite trucks lined the road. Inside, the warden doubled down. He cut off visitation rights, restricted phone calls, and declared lockdowns that stretched for days. His message was clear. Control belonged to him, not the investigators, not the press, and certainly not the inmates. When Alicia confronted him about Monique's attack, he brushed it off with a smirk. "Prison is dangerous, detective. Accidents happen." But Alicia saw the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He was enjoying this. The fear, the spectacle, the sense that he was still scripting every scene. The pregnant women became prisoners within prisoners, moved to isolated cells for their safety, which only deepened suspicions. Tamika clutched her hidden notebook like it was a lifeline, jotting down names of guards she thought were in on it. Renee stopped speaking altogether, retreating into a silence so deep it frightened even the others. Shauna grew more reckless, slamming her fists on doors, daring the guards to take her on. And Monique lay in the infirmary, pale and broken, her belly a reminder that she was carrying evidence no one could erase. The rest of the prison teetered on the edge. Small riots broke out, food trays thrown, fires started in trash bins, shouts echoing down corridors. One night, inmates banged on their bars in unison for nearly an hour, chanting "Murderer! Murderer!" until guards stormed in with pepper spray. For Alicia, the escalation confirmed her worst fears. The warden wasn't just covering up crimes. He was cultivating fear like a farmer tends crops. Every attack, every death, every whisper of suspicion fed his control. And unless she could break the cycle soon, she knew more women would fall, and the prison itself would spiral into bloodshed. By the end of that week, the prison was no longer just a correctional facility. It was with one man tightening his grip. And somewhere in the dark, the next move was already being planned. Detective Alicia Monroe had seen corruption before, but nothing prepared her for the layers she was pulling apart inside these walls. Carla's suspicious death, Monique's brutal attack, the way the prison seemed to run on fear rather than rules. It all pointed back to the same man. But speculation wasn't enough. She needed evidence so undeniable that even the warden's allies couldn't bury it. That evidence arrived in a padded envelope from the state crime lab. Inside were the DNA results Alicia had been waiting for. She sat in the cramped office the prison had begrudgingly loaned her, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and scanned the pages. Each of the 5 pregnancies, Carla included, shared the same father. The match was indisputable, the warden. Alicia's chest tightened as she read the words again. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was science. But the DNA alone wasn't the whole story. As she dug deeper, more threads began to unravel. A whistleblower from the IT department came forward after hours, trembling as he placed a flash drive on her desk. "He told me to erase it," the young technician whispered. "The night Carla died. He said if I didn't, I'd regret it." On the drive were fragments of corrupted video, enough to show a tall figure in uniform walking the women's wing minutes before the camera feed mysteriously cut out. The angle wasn't perfect, the resolution grainy, but it was enough to suggest what everyone already feared. Then came the most chilling piece. One of the guards, a man who had been loyal to the warden for years, cracked during questioning. He admitted he'd seen the warden escorting Carla to the infirmary late at night weeks before her death. He didn't intervene. Fear had sealed his lips, but the memory haunted him. "She looked scared," he muttered, voice shaking. "Not like a woman sneaking off for a favor. Like someone being dragged." The pregnant inmates themselves, still terrified, began to give Alicia pieces of the puzzle. Tamika slipped her notebook into Alicia's hands. Pages filled with careful notes on dates, late-night visits, and whispered threats. Renee, her voice barely above a whisper, confessed that the warden had promised her letters to her daughter would be mailed only if she cooperated. Monique, pale and trembling, confirmed that Carla had been planning to talk, to expose him. She said she was done being his experiment, Monique whispered. The next day, she was gone. Piece by piece, the scheme emerged. The pregnancies weren't random, they weren't consensual, and they weren't accidents. They were deliberate, calculated acts of domination. The warden had used his power to turn the women into unwilling participants in what he considered a test, a grotesque experiment to prove that even in the most controlled environment, he could bend human lives to his will. And then Alicia found the smoking gun. Buried in the warden's office computer files was an email draft, never sent, but saved. It was written in his clipped, confident tone. "Control is not maintained by rules. Control is proven when rules are irrelevant. They will carry my legacy inside them." The words chilled her to the bone. He hadn't just committed crimes. He had written his manifesto. When Alicia confronted him with the evidence, his mask cracked for the first time. He leaned forward, eyes burning, and hissed, "You think you can take this from me? I made this place. Without me, it falls apart. You don't understand. I'm not the villain here. I'm the architect." For a brief moment, the polished officer vanished, and in his place was the predator Alicia had been chasing all along. By the time she walked out of his office, she knew there was no turning back. The DNA, the video fragments, the guard's testimony, Tamika's notes, the manifesto, it was all enough to build a case. But Alicia also knew the warden wouldn't go quietly. He had already killed once to protect his secret. If he felt the walls closing in, there was no telling how many more lives he would take before the truth reached the outside world. The scheme had been unmasked, but the battle to bring him down was only beginning. The trial of Warden Franklin Hayes became one of the most watched courtroom dramas in the state's history. By the time jury selection began, the courthouse steps were a circus. News vans lined the street, protesters waved signs, and commentators dissected every new leak on primetime television. The public wanted a monster, and the prosecution was determined to deliver one. Inside the courtroom, the contrast was stark. Hayes entered each morning in a neatly pressed suit, his posture ramrod straight, his expression calm, almost smug. To the casual observer, he still looked like a man in charge, a decorated officer with decades of service. But to those who had followed the case, he was the architect of cruelty, the man accused of turning his prison into a breeding ground for power, coercion, and death. The prosecution's case was devastating. Assistant District Attorney Carling Nguyen, sharp and relentless, laid it out piece by piece. First came the DNA results. Expert witnesses testified that all 5 pregnancies shared the same father, and the statistical certainty was overwhelming. Hayes could not deny it. The defense tried to muddy the waters, hinting at possibility of consensual relationships, but the sheer consistency of the evidence gutted that argument. Then came the guard who cracked under questioning. He sat stiffly on the witness stand, eyes lowered, and admitted he had seen Hayes escort Carla down the corridor the night before she died. His voice quavered as he described her fear, the way her eyes darted to him like a silent plea. When asked why he hadn't intervened, his answer was simple: because I was afraid of him. The jury shifted in their seats, the gallery murmured, and Ada Nguyen seized the moment. Fear, she argued, was Hayes's true weapon. Not just fear of punishment, but fear of being erased, fear of disappearing like Carla. The testimony of the surviving inmates was the most gut-wrenching. Tamika, composed but visibly trembling, read aloud from her notebook, documenting the warden's late-night visits and veiled threats. Renee broke down as she described how Hayes had promised to mail letters to her daughter in exchange for her compliance. Monique, her voice small but steady, testified about the night she was attacked, repeating the warning she'd been given: talk, and you'll end up like Carla. Shauna, defiant as ever, glared directly at Hayes when she said, "He thought he owned us, but we're not his anymore." Each woman's story was different, but together they painted a picture too horrifying to ignore. They weren't just inmates. They were victims of a man who had twisted the power of his position into a tool of terror. The defense fought hard, portraying Hayes as a scapegoat in a failing system, a man being punished for lapses that were systemic rather than personal. They pointed to his spotless service record, the riots he had quelled, the commendations on his wall. They tried to sow doubt, suggesting the women had motives to lie, reduce sentences, sympathy, attention. But the more they pressed, the more hollow their arguments sounded. The coup de grace came when Ada Nguyen revealed the draft email Hayes had written, the manifesto Alicia had unearthed. Projected onto the courtroom screen, the words rang like a confession. Control is not maintained by rules. Control is proven when rules are irrelevant. They will carry my legacy inside them. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the defense had no way to spin it. When Hayes took the stand in his own defense, the mask cracked. His voice, usually so measured, shook with anger as he railed against the system, the inmates, the investigators. You think you can run a prison without fear? Without me, that place would collapse into chaos. I kept order. I gave it meaning. They weren't victims. They were proof of my control. His words, meant as justification, sounded instead like the ravings of a man drunk on power. The jury deliberated less than a day. When they filed back into the courtroom, the foreman's voice was steady, guilty on all counts: rape, coercion, conspiracy, and first-degree murder in the death of Carla. Hayes stood motionless as the verdict was read, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on some distant point. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. Sentencing followed swiftly, life without the possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted. Families of the victims wept, advocates embraced, and reporters scrambled to capture the scene. Hayes was led away in shackles, his polished shoes replaced with state-issued boots, his suit traded for prison gray. Outside, the protest transformed into a vigil. Candles flickered in memory of Carla, and signs now read justice for the 5. For the surviving women, justice was a complicated word. Nothing could erase the scars, the fear, or the lives upended. But the verdict proved one thing: Even behind the tallest walls, power could be challenged, and monsters could fall. For the first time in years, the prison no longer belonged to Hayes. His empire of fear had crumbled, not with riots or bloodshed, but with testimony, evidence, and truth laid bare under oath. The architect of control was now just another inmate, swallowed by the very system he once ruled. The prison was quieter after the verdict, but it was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, not peaceful. For the women who had survived, justice came with a bitter aftertaste. Renee still clutched the photo of her daughter during visiting hours, but her voice cracked whenever she spoke of the trial. She said it felt like winning a battle only to realize the war had already cost her everything. Monique, the youngest, was transferred to a different facility for her safety. She walked into the new compound with her head bowed, her body scarred but still carrying life inside her. For her, every heartbeat she felt in her womb was both a reminder of trauma and a fragile thread of hope. Tamika kept her notebook, though now it held fewer secrets and more prayers. She wrote about the trial, about Carla's death, about the day she finally believed someone on the outside was listening. She said she wanted the pages to outlive her sentence, proof that silence doesn't always win. Shauna, fierce and unbroken, seemed almost relieved. For the first time, her rage wasn't directed at other inmates or herself. It had a name, a face, and now a sentence. The prison system scrambled to repair the damage. A new warden was installed, one with a reputation for transparency, and outside monitors were brought in to enforce stricter oversight. Policies shifted, more cameras, more audits, more female staff and sensitive posts. Politicians promised change, but for many, the promises felt rehearsed. Those who had seen the fear firsthand knew that rules were only as strong as the people willing to uphold them. Outside the walls, the scandal left ripples. Advocates for prison reform seized on the case, demanding stronger protections for female inmates, better reporting channels for abuse, and accountability for those who turn a blind eye. Families of the victims gathered at candlelight vigils, holding signs with Carla's name in bold letters, reminding the world that she was more than a statistic. Hashtags trended, documentaries were pitched, and for a brief moment, the country looked directly at a system it preferred to ignore. As for Hayes, he was stripped of everything: his title, his authority, his polished shoes. In prison, he was no longer the architect of fear, but just another number, another man behind bars. Some whispered that the worst punishment wasn't the sentence itself, but the knowledge that he now lived under the same rules he once twisted for his own game. The silence of his downfall was louder than all his speeches about control. The story didn't end neatly. The children carried by the surviving women entered the world with complicated beginnings, born into a system that had failed their mothers. The scars, both visible and hidden, would last far longer than the headlines. But the case carved a warning into the public record. Unchecked power in the wrong hands could turn a place of supposed justice into a nightmare. For those who followed the trial, the lesson was stark. Power can corrupt, silence can kill, and sometimes the bravest act is simply telling the truth, even when the cost is unbearable. The prison will never forget the 5 women who were forced into a scheme they never chose, or the one who died because she refused to stay silent. Justice had come, but it came too late for Carla. And that truth is what lingers long after the cameras left, a shadow stretching across those walls, reminding everyone that behind the bars, humanity is still fragile and always worth fighting for.